I was ready as always. The moon sat heavy in the sky, spilling silver over the treetops. I crouched low, my fingers brushing the damp earth as I listened. The woods had gone too quiet. No rustling leaves, no hooting owls, just a silence so unnatural it made my skin itch. Something was watching me. I tightened my grip on the dagger strapped to my thigh. The handle was warm from my palm, the leather worn smooth from years of training. My father's voice echoed in my head. Werewolves hunt in packs. They let you think you're alone before they strike. I wasn't stupid enough to fall for that. Moving slowly, I stepped over a thick tree root, keeping my breathing steady. My dark hunting clothes blended with the shadows, the black leather hugging my frame. I wasn't new to this. I'd spent my entire life tracking monsters, trained to be faster, smarter, deadlier, and yet, something felt wrong tonight. I wasn't tracking the beast, it was tracking me. A flicker of movement caught my eye, a shadow shifting behind the thick trunks. I spun, dagger raised, but the space was empty, just trees and the endless stretch of darkness. The wind stirred the leaves above me, whispering secrets I couldn't decipher. I swallowed hard and forced myself to keep moving. The path ahead sloped downward, leading to a clearing bathed in moonlight. I hesitated. Open spaces meant vulnerability, but it also meant bait. Perfect. Pressing my back to a tree, I reached into my belt and pulled out a small silver blade. If the creature was nearby, it would smell the metal. A few seconds was all I needed to get it out in the open. My legs burned from crouching, but I didn't move. My pulse hammered against my ribs as I waited. Then I saw it, a shadow unfurling from the darkness. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, muscles shifting beneath a thick coat of obsidian fur. The beast was huge, towering over me even at a distance. But it wasn't just a werewolf, it was him. Xander. I'd heard stories about him, whispers exchanged in the dead of night by hunters who feared speaking too loudly. The alpha of the Blood Moon Pack, the ruthless leader who ruled with power that made even my father wary. And now he was standing between me and my escape. Xander tilted his head, golden eyes gleaming like molten fire. He wasn't in his full wolf form. I should have run. Instead, I lifted my chin and curled my fingers tighter around the hilt of my dagger. You're just another beast, just another monster. His lips curved. He knows what I'm thinking. A cold weight settled in my stomach. I darted forward fast as lightning, blade aimed straight for his throat. Xander barely moved. 1 second, I was attacking. The next, my wrist was caught in a grip like steel. His fingers burned against my skin, heat radiating through the leather of my gloves. I twisted, trying to wrench free, but his hold didn't loosen. He pulled me closer, his scent hitting me like a drug. Not the wild, earthy stench of a wolf, but something richer, dark spice and smoke, something dangerous.
You're quick.
He murmured, voice smooth as silk.
But not quick enough.
I bared my teeth. Let me go.
Not a chance.
I kicked at his legs, aiming for his knees, but he was faster. In a blink, he spun me, yanking my arm behind my back. My chest collided with his, and I felt every inch of his solid frame against me. Panic surged through me. I wasn't used to being overpowered. I was always the hunter, not the prey. His breath brushed my ear.
You reek of silver.
I gritted my teeth. Good. Maybe it will destroy you. Xander chuckled, a deep, low sound that vibrated through my bones.
You are reckless, but brave.
I struggled, twisting my body, but his grip was like iron. Heat rolled off him, and the closeness sent something unwanted skittering down my spine. He wasn't just holding me captive. He was studying me. His free hand brushed over the dagger strapped to my thigh. My body tensed as he plucked it from its sheath and tossed it aside like it was nothing more than a toy. Then his gaze met mine. Up close, his golden eyes weren't just gold. They swirled, flecks of amber shifting like flames. Something in them made my stomach flip, not in fear, but in something far more dangerous. Attraction. I shoved it down. I wouldn't fall for this.
I'm taking you with me.
He said, voice rich with authority.
Don't fight me, Seraphina.
The sound of my name in his mouth sent a bolt of fury through me. He had no right to say it, no right to know it. I spat at his feet. I'd rather destroy myself. His jaw ticked.
Not an option.
In one swift movement, he bent, tossing me over his shoulder like I weighed nothing. I gasped, thrashing, but his arm locked over my thighs, holding me in place. "Put me down, you demon!" I shouted, pounding my fists against his back. He didn't even flinch.
I like you better when you're not trying to destroy me.
He mused, carrying me like I was some kind of prize. I twisted, rage boiling in my blood. "Let me go!" Xander exhaled slowly, almost as if he found my resistance amusing. Then, without a word, he shifted. I barely had time to process it before my world turned upside down. 1 second, I was draped over his shoulder. The next, I was trapped in the grip of a massive wolf. His fur was black as midnight, his frame even larger than before. His paws crushed the earth as he started running, carrying me with a speed that made the trees blur. I didn't scream. I refused to scream. Instead, I pressed my fists against his thick fur, grinding my teeth. This wasn't over. I would escape. I would destroy him. But as the forest whipped past us and the scent of fire and wolves filled my nose, a terrifying realization settled deep in my gut. I wasn't just being taken prisoner. I was being taken to his pack. The moment we crossed into his territory, I knew escape wouldn't be easy. Xander didn't stop running. His massive wolf form carried me across the thick stretch of forest, his paws hitting the ground with force, shaking loose the fallen leaves. I fought against him, thrashing, but it only made his grip tighten. The thick black fur bristled beneath my hands as I pushed, clawed, but nothing made him stop. The Blood Moon Pack's fortress loomed in the distance, stone towers stretching toward the sky, torches burning along the walls. The place was massive, built to withstand attacks, to intimidate, and it was working. As soon as we entered the clearing, werewolves surrounded us. Dozens of them, all shifting back into their human forms. Their eyes gleamed in the dim firelight, tracking my every move. Some stood tall, arms crossed, unimpressed. Others wore curious expressions, heads tilting as they took in the sight of their alpha carrying a human over his shoulder, like a prize. Xander didn't speak until we reached the stone steps leading to the main fortress doors. Then, without warning, he shifted back. I crashed onto the hard ground. My elbows scraped against the rough stone, a sharp sting shooting up my arms. Before I could scramble to my feet, Xander was towering over me, his golden eyes glowing in the darkness.
You put up a good fight,
he said, dusting off his hands like he hadn't just kidnapped me.
but you'll learn soon enough. It's pointless.
I shot him a glare. "You're a coward." The smirk that crossed his lips sent my anger skyrocketing. He crouched beside me, so close I could feel the heat radiating off him. His voice was low, almost amused.
A coward would have destroyed you the moment you stepped into my territory. I, on the other hand, have plans for you.
I braced my palms against the ground and pushed up, my muscles protesting. "Whatever you think I'm going to do, you're wrong." Xander let out a slow breath, shaking his head like I was some naive fool.
You really don't get it, do you?
He leaned in just enough for his scent to hit me. Smoke and cedar, mixed with something raw and untamed.
You're mine now.
Something sharp coiled in my chest. I yanked my arm away, ignoring the way his fingers lingered for a second too long before he let go. I belonged to no one. A murmur passed through the crowd. Some of the wolves exchanged glances, waiting for Xander's reaction. He didn't look angry. That was the worst part. He looked amused, like I was entertainment.
I like that fire.
He said, standing. His voice carried easily over the gathered pack.
But let's get one thing straight. You're not leaving until I say so.
My hands curled into fists. Watch me. I spun on my heel, ready to run, but before I even took a step, something cold snapped around my wrist. A metal cuff, heavy, unyielding, silver. The burn seared through my skin instantly, a cruel, biting heat. I sucked in a sharp breath, clenching my teeth against the pain. Xander's voice was maddeningly calm.
Try to run and you'll regret it.
I swallowed back the curse that threatened to spill from my lips. The cuff wasn't just for show, it was spelled. I could feel the energy thrumming beneath the metal, binding me. A trap, a cage disguised as a chain. I lifted my chin, refusing to show weakness. Afraid I'll get away? Xander stepped closer, his golden eyes burning into mine.
I never let what's mine slip away.
The words sent something strange through me, a heat curling low in my stomach. But I shoved it down, focusing on the anger boiling in my blood. He turned to the wolves standing by.
Take her inside.
Two of them moved toward me, but I jerked back, my nails biting into my palms. I can walk on my own? Xander arched a brow.
Then walk.
I forced my feet to move. The silver cuff weighed down my wrist with every step, a brutal reminder that I wasn't free. The fortress doors loomed ahead, opening into a dimly lit hall lined with stone walls and flickering torches. The scent of wolves and burning wood filled the air. As I stepped inside, my gaze flickered to the windows. Small, narrow slits, not big enough to escape through. Every inch of this place was designed to keep people in. My jaw tightened. The moment I got the chance, I'd make him regret ever bringing me here. The halls stretched long, the stone beneath my boots cool against my skin. I barely noticed the way the wolves parted as Xander led me through, their eyes lingering on me with curiosity. Some looked wary, others intrigued. I didn't care. I only cared about getting out of here. Xander stopped in front of a massive wooden door, pushing it open with one hand.
You'll stay here.
I stepped inside, taking in the room. It wasn't a prison cell. It was worse. A bedroom. The space was large, filled with rich, dark wood furniture. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting long shadows across the thick rugs covering the floor. A massive bed sat against the far wall, covered in furs and deep red blankets. This wasn't just any room, it was his room. My pulse skipped. You're joking. Xander leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed.
Do I look like I'm joking?
I stared at him, searching his face for any sign that this was some twisted test. You expect me to sleep here? His lips twitched, like he was fighting back another smirk.
Would you prefer the dungeon?
My fingers twitched at my sides. I'd prefer to be anywhere but here. He pushed off the frame, walking toward me at a slow, unhurried pace. I held my ground, refusing to step back. Xander reached out, brushing a stray strand of hair from my face. His touch was light, but it sent a jolt straight through me.
Then you better get used to disappointment.
I clenched my jaw, refusing to react. His hand lingered for a second longer before he stepped away, his eyes flickering to the silver cuff on my wrist.
You'll wear that until I trust you. And you better get used to wearing it.
Xander let out a low chuckle, shaking his head.
You really are something else.
I didn't answer. I was too busy planning, too busy thinking of every way I could break that trust. Because no matter what Xander thought, no matter how powerful he was, how strong, how infuriatingly smug, I would escape, even if it destroyed me. I wasn't tired, not even close. But exhaustion had a way of creeping in when you were trapped with nowhere to go. The fireplace crackled, its glow stretching across the dark wooden walls, flickering over the heavy bookshelves and the carved bedposts. The warmth should have been comforting, but every inch of this room reminded me that I wasn't free, that I was being kept here, not as a prisoner in chains, but something worse. A possession. Xander hadn't locked the door. That, in itself, was infuriating. He wanted me to know I could try to leave but wouldn't get far. The silver cuff on my wrist made sure of that, its weight pressed against my skin, a quiet reminder that he had the upper hand. But I wasn't the type to sit around waiting for mercy. I moved toward the window, pressing my palm against the cold glass. Outside, the fortress stretched across the land like a sleeping beast. Stone walls, towering gates, and the shadows of patrolling wolves. Beyond that, the forest. My way out. The door creaked open. I turned fast, my body tensing as Xander stepped inside. He didn't look surprised to see me standing there studying the window like I was memorizing every escape route. If anything, he looked amused.
You won't get far.
He said. I folded my arms, leaning against the windowsill. That's what you think. Xander exhaled slowly, walking toward the table in the center of the room. He poured himself a drink from a dark glass bottle, the liquid swirling amber under the firelight. His movements were unhurried, effortless, like a man who had never once worried about someone slipping through his fingers. His confidence was irritating. He took a slow sip, his sharp golden eyes watching me over the rim of the glass.
You should eat.
I didn't move. Not hungry. He set the glass down, rolling his shoulders like he was shaking off tension. His shirt was slightly unbuttoned, the fabric loose around his frame. He looked relaxed, comfortable. Like keeping me here was no different from having a house guest. It made me want to break something.
Suit yourself.
He stepped closer, the scent of smoke and cedar reaching me before he did.
But I don't want you collapsing on my floor from starvation. It would be inconvenient.
Would it? I tilted my head, giving him a look of mock curiosity. Or would it be easier? No fight, no struggle, just... I snapped my fingers. Problem solved. Xander chuckled, low and deep.
You're not a problem. Not yet.
His gaze flickered to the cuff around my wrist. For the first time, something passed through his expression. Quick, unreadable. Not regret, but something close to it. He reached for it, his fingers brushing against my skin. The moment he made contact, my pulse did something strange, something I didn't like. His touch was warm, steady, like he had all the time in the world. You can take this off, I said.
Right now.
His lips twitched, almost smirking.
I could.
I lifted my chin. Then do it. Xander didn't move. He kept his fingers lightly against the metal, tracing the edges, testing its weight. His touch was barely there, but it sent a slow heat curling along my skin. I hated that my body reacted to him. I hated that he knew it. His voice dropped lower.
Not yet.
The words settled between us, heavy and unmovable. I swallowed back my frustration, stepping away. His fingers slipped from the cuff, but the imprint of his touch lingered like a ghost. I turned my back to him, staring at the fire instead. He let me have the silence for a moment before he spoke again.
Do you know why I brought you here?
I let out a slow breath, keeping my voice steady. Because you think you own me. Xander was quiet for a long time. Then,
That's not why.
something in his tone made me glance at him. He was watching me carefully now, his usual amusement fading into something sharper. He wasn't smiling anymore.
You're a survivor.
He said.
I can see it in you.
I clenched my jaw. You don't know anything about me. Xander tilted his head slightly.
I know you're already planning 3 different ways to escape. I know you'll try it the moment you think I'm distracted. And I know that if I let you go, you won't just disappear. You'll fight back.
A slow smirk played on his lips. That's why I brought you here. Not because I think I own you, but because you're dangerous. I breathed in sharply. Xander took a step closer, closing the distance between us. His presence wrapped around me, making the room feel smaller. He wasn't touching me, but the space between us crackled with something unspoken.
Stay.
He murmured. I didn't answer. He reached up, his fingers brushing against a loose strand of my hair. He tucked it behind my ear, his touch slow and deliberate. My breath caught, just for a second. You're playing a dangerous game, I whispered. Xander's gaze burned into mine.
I always win.
For the first time, I let myself hold his stare without looking away, without retreating. And for the first time, he didn't look as sure of himself as he claimed to be. I had been served food and everything a human needs, but why I had been kept here. The next day, when I wake up, the heavy wooden door, locked from the outside, made it clear that I was a prisoner, and Xander was my captor. He stood by the window, arms crossed, his golden eyes watching me with the same unreadable expression he always wore, The morning light cast shadows across his face, sharpening the angles of his jaw, making him look even more untouchable. I hated how calm he was, how composed, like none of this was wrong. Like he actually believed he had the right to keep me here. I clenched my fists. "You can stop pretending now." Xander raised a brow.
Pretending?
I took a step forward, my nails digging into my palms. "That you're anything other than my enemy." He exhaled slowly, shaking his head.
I'm not your enemy, Serafina.
I scoffed. "Right, and I'm supposed to just believe that?"
You believe what you want,
he said, voice measured.
but the truth doesn't change just because you refuse to see it.
I narrowed my eyes. "Then tell me the truth, Xander. Why am I here? Why am I locked in this fortress like a criminal?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied me, like he was debating how much to say. And then finally, he said,
You'll understand when the time comes.
My blood boiled. I let out a bitter laugh, throwing up my hands. Oh, of course, the cryptic, mysterious answer. How convenient.
Serafina?
Number, don't do that. Don't act like you're protecting me when all you've done is keep me locked up like a prisoner. His expression darkened slightly, but he didn't look away.
I'm protecting you from something bigger than you realize.
I stepped closer, glaring up at him. Then say it. Who exactly am I in danger from? He started.
You're...
But then he stopped. Silence. You're what? I asked. Xander's jaw tightened. His fingers curled slightly at his sides like he wanted to say more, but something was stopping him. I could see it, feel it. That's what I thought, I said bitterly, turning away.
Serafina.
He said, his voice quieter now.
You need to understand that I'm not the villain.
I froze for half a second before laughing dryly. You kidnapped me, locked me in this room, and now you're trying to convince me that you're the good guy? Xander sighed.
There are worse things out there than being here with me.
I turned sharply. Oh? Is that supposed to make me feel better? His golden eyes flickered with something unreadable.
Number. But it's the truth.
I stared at him, heart pounding in frustration. He was holding something back. He knew more than he was letting on, and it was driving me insane. But no matter how much I pushed, he wouldn't break. And that terrified me more than anything. I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. You're wasting your time, Xander. If you think I'll ever trust you, you're wrong. Xander took a step closer, his presence suddenly overwhelming.
I'm not asking for your trust, Serafina.
His voice was lower now, smoother.
I'm asking for something more.
A chill ran down my spine. What? His gaze locked onto mine.
Acceptance.
My breath hitched. Acceptance? He nodded.
That you and I are bonded, that you're my mate.
A cold, bitter silence stretched between us, and then I laughed. It wasn't soft, it wasn't sweet, it was sharp, cutting, filled with every ounce of fury and disbelief inside me. You think I'll accept that? I took a step back, shaking my head. You think I'll just forget everything and suddenly want to be with you? Xander didn't flinch, didn't react, he simply waited, and that only made me angrier. I crossed my arms. Let me make this very clear. I don't care what fate says. I don't care about some bond I never asked for. I will never accept you as my mate, never. His eyes darkened, but not with anger. Something else, something deeper. Something that sent a shiver down my spine.
You can fight it all you want.
He murmured, voice like a slow-burning flame.
But it won't change anything.
Watch me, I snapped. He exhaled through his nose, his fingers flexing slightly at his sides.
You're stubborn.
And you're delusional if you think you can force this on me, I said. Xander sighed, rubbing his temples.
I don't want to force anything, Serafina, but I also won't let you walk into danger just because you refuse to see it.
I clenched my fists. There it is again, this mysterious danger you refuse to name. Xander met my gaze steadily.
You'll know soon enough.
I swallowed the frustrated scream rising in my throat. This was pointless. I would never believe him, and he would never give me a straight answer. So what was the point? I turned away, arms crossed, willing my voice to stay even. Just leave. Xander hesitated. I could feel his presence behind me, lingering like a storm that refused to pass. Then, after what felt like forever, he exhaled.
As you wish.
He murmured. I heard his footsteps move toward the door, the soft creak of the wood as it opened. And then, just before he stepped out, he spoke again.
Like it or not, Serafina, I am not your enemy.
I kept my back to him, jaw tight. Then prove it, I whispered. For a long moment, there was only silence. And then, without another word, Xander stepped out, closing the door behind him. The fortress felt like a cage. The cold stone walls stretched endlessly, each corridor leading nowhere, each locked door reminding me of what I had lost, my freedom, my pack, my home. Xander had made sure I was trapped, far from everything familiar. The garden was the only place that felt remotely alive. The scent of roses filled the air. But I wasn't alone. I sensed someone before I saw him, a shift in the air, the faint sound of careful footsteps. I turned sharply, my pulse spiking. Benjamin stood a few feet away, hands raised slightly in a non-threatening gesture. He was one of Xander's men, or at least that's what I had been told. He had been watching me for days, always lurking in the background, never speaking. Until now. You shouldn't be here, I said, my voice low, laced with warning. A small smirk tugged at the corner of his lips, but there was something wary in his eyes.
I was about to say the same to you.
I crossed my arms. I don't need a lecture, just tell me what you want. He sighed, stepping closer.
I want to talk.
About what? I asked, not trusting his sudden friendliness. Benjamin glanced around as if making sure no one was listening. Then his voice dropped to a whisper.
About getting out of here.
I froze. My breath caught in my throat. His expression remained unreadable, but there was a flicker of something that wasn't just manipulation.
Xander isn't just keeping you here, Serafina. He's keeping me here too.
I narrowed my eyes. You work for him. Benjamin let out a humorless chuckle.
Work for him? That's a nice way to put it. More like, I don't have a choice.
I studied him carefully. You expect me to believe you're just another prisoner? He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his dark hair.
I expect you to believe the truth. I never wanted to be here, and I sure as hell don't want to spend the rest of my life being Xander's pawn. I know you don't either.
I swallowed hard. I wanted to push him away, to call him a liar, but there was something about the way he spoke, like he knew exactly what it felt like to be trapped, like he understood the weight of these walls the same way I did. You're lying, I said, but my voice lacked conviction. Benjamin tilted his head.
If I were lying, would I risk sneaking out here to talk to you? You think Xander would let that slide?
He had a point. I hated that he had a point. Still, I wasn't ready to let my guard down. Why come to me now?
Because I've been watching.
He admitted.
You're strong, but you're alone. Xander has made sure of that. No friends, no allies, no one to help you. We need each other.
I stiffened at his words. He wasn't wrong. Xander had stripped me of everything, including the comfort of companionship, but I can't trust him either. And you want to be my ally? I asked, skepticism dripping from my tone. Benjamin's golden eyes met mine.
I want us to survive.
Something about the way he said it sent a shiver. Benjamin in a low voice.
There is way to get outside.
I inhaled slowly. You said you know a way out. A small smile ghosted across his lips.
Not yet, but I will.
I clenched my fists. That's not enough.
It will be.
He assured me.
I'm working on it, and when I find a way, I'll get you out of here. Both of us.
Hope was dangerous, but I couldn't stop the small flicker of it from igniting inside me. Why should I trust you? I asked. Benjamin took a step closer, his voice softer now.
Because you don't have a choice.
I hated that he was right. I turned away, staring at the sky, my thoughts tangled.
Serafina?
He said gently. I glanced back at him, surprised by the way he said my name, like it wasn't just another title, another obligation.
You don't have to be alone.
He said.
Not here. Not with me.
I hesitated. And what happens if Xander finds out you're helping me? Benjamin smirked, but there was no humor in it.
Then we're both dead.
I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. That's not reassuring,
It's honest.
he countered. For the first time in days, I felt something other than exhaustion and anger. I wasn't sure what it was, but it was something. You're serious about this? I asked. He nodded.
Dead serious.
I studied him one last time, searching for a lie, a crack in his story, but I found none. Fine, I said at last, but if you betray me, I'll make sure you regret it. Benjamin grinned, the first real smile I had seen from him.
That's the spirit.
And with that he turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving me standing alone in the garden. But for the first time, I didn't feel entirely alone. Over the next few days, Benjamin became a shadow in my world. He wasn't always around, but when he was, the weight pressing down on me felt lighter. We spoke in passing, brief conversations when Xander wasn't hovering nearby. He asked about my life before this, about the things I missed. I didn't realize how much I craved simple conversation until I had it again. He was easy to talk to in a way that Xander wasn't. Where Xander was all sharp edges and control, Benjamin was something else, someone who listened without looking for an advantage. Or maybe I just wanted to believe that. One evening, we found ourselves in the library, surrounded by shelves that smelled of ink and dust. The fire crackled softly, casting light across the room. I sat in the oversized chair by the window, my legs tucked beneath me, while Benjamin leaned against the edge of the desk, arms crossed.
If you could be anywhere right now,
He said, watching me carefully.
where would you go?
I traced a finger along the spine of a book, pretending to think when I already knew the answer. Home. Benjamin exhaled, tilting his head slightly.
And if you had the chance?
I looked at him then. Really looked at him. There was something there, beneath the surface of his words, something careful. You're asking if I would run, I said. He didn't deny it. I should have hesitated. I should have questioned why he was bringing this up. But I didn't, because the truth was, I had been thinking about it long before he ever spoke the words. I don't have a chance, I murmured, more to myself than him. Benjamin leaned closer, his voice softer now.
What if you did?
The air between us changed. It was no longer just conversation, it was something real. I searched his face for deception, for anything that might tell me he was lying, but all I saw was certainty. He meant it. He was offering me a way out. I should have been more careful. I should have realized that Xander was already watching. He never said it outright, but I could see it in the way his eyes lingered on me longer than before. The way his jaw clenched when he saw me speaking with Benjamin. He didn't trust me. And for once, I didn't blame him. Next evening, I found Xander waiting for me outside my room. His arms were crossed, his expression unreadable, but I knew better than to think he was calm.
You're getting comfortable here.
He said. I met his gaze. Should I be miserable instead? He didn't react to my sarcasm. He just watched me the way he always did, like he was waiting for me to slip, to reveal something I wasn't supposed to. I refused to. He stepped closer, his voice dropping.
Benjamin isn't your friend.
I lifted my chin. You don't get to decide who I trust. His eyes darkened.
Trust him too much, and you'll regret it.
For a moment, I almost believed he cared. Almost. Xander's face was unreadable, but it seemed like he was worried about me, but why? I held his gaze, refusing to let him see the doubt creeping in. Good night, Xander, I said, stepping past him. He didn't stop me, but I felt his gaze burn into my back as I walked away. Benjamin met me in the gardens later that night. The moon was high, casting silver light over the stone pathways. He looked different this time, more serious, more certain.
I meant what I said.
He murmured, his voice low.
I can get you out.
I swallowed, my fingers tightening around the fabric of my dress. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. How? I whispered. Benjamin took a slow step closer, his hand brushing against mine, not grabbing, not forcing, just offering.
There's a way through the northern gate,
He said.
It's unguarded at midnight. If you're willing to take the risk.
I barely heard the rest, because for the first time in weeks I saw something I hadn't in a long time. Hope. And it had a name, Benjamin. I was hoping that Benjamin will help me, but I have to wait until he finalized the escape plan. But for now, it was enough. But one thing I knew, that Xander was acknowledged of my friendship with Benjamin, or at least it seemed like that. Thoughts about escaping and Benjamin was filling my mind. I was taking rest inside my room. Will we escape? Or Benjamin will betray me? Or it is all just another test? Maybe Xander had asked Benjamin to test me? But if Xander is really a monster, then why didn't he harm me? Why did he pretend always like he cares? Is all this Xander's some plan? My mind was messed up. I looked around. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows on the walls of my room, making the space feel even smaller than it already was. Then, the door creaked open. I tensed immediately, my back straightening as I watched Xander step inside. He moved with the confidence of a man who feared nothing, his dark eyes studying me as if he already knew every thought running through my mind.
You're awake,
He said smoothly, closing the door behind him. I didn't respond. His lips curved slightly.
You've been here for days now. Tell me, Serafina, do you feel good? Have you come to accept that I mean no harm?
I scoffed. You think I should believe you just because I haven't been tortured? His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his gaze.
You misunderstand me.
Do I? I folded my arms. You kidnapped me. You locked me inside this fortress against my will, and now you expect me to trust you? Xander replied.
You was about to take me down, remember? You was trying to hunt, remember?
I exhaled. Because you all werewolves are monsters. Xander paused for a moment and then he said,
Who told you? Then how are you alive yet?
I don't know. Maybe you have some other plans for me, I said. Xander raised an eyebrow.
Or maybe we are not monsters. You had misunderstood.
I was unable to decide what to reply. Then Xander added,
We are werewolves, not monsters. Have you ever saw any of my pack members hunting on any human?
I didn't had answers because I haven't saw anything like that in my life, but as I was taught since my childhood that werewolves are bad, they are monsters, I couldn't change my mind suddenly. Then trying to change the topic, I smiled. What you want? Xander sighed, stepping closer. I resisted the urge to move back.
Serafina,
He said in a calm, measured tone.
You are safe here. Whether you believe it or not, I am the only one in this place who truly has your best interests at heart.
I let out a bitter laugh. My best interests? You took me from my home, kept me locked away, and now you want me to believe you're my protector? Xander's jaw tightened for a brief second before his expression softened again.
I understand why you feel this way,
He said.
but you fail to see the bigger picture. You think I am your enemy, but the truth is, I am the only one standing between you and the real threats out there.
I narrowed my eyes. And what threats would those be? Xander exhaled slowly, as if choosing his words carefully.
Your own people.
My stomach twisted. What? His gaze was steady.
You think they care for you? That they would welcome you back with open arms? Serafina, you have no idea what has been whispered in the shadows since you've been gone.
I clenched my fists. Don't twist things. My people are my family. Xander shook his head slightly, his voice dropping to something almost gentle.
They are your past, and I am your future.
I felt a chill run through me. I don't belong here, Xander, and no matter what you say, I will never believe you over my own people. He tilted his head, watching me carefully.
Even when I tell you that not everyone in this fortress is what they seem?
My breath caught for a second, but I quickly masked it. What do you mean? Xander took another step forward, his voice lowering.
You think he is your friend, don't you?
I froze. Xander's lips twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile.
Be careful who you place your trust in, Serafina. This fortress has many faces, and not all of them are as they appear.
A spark of defiance flared in my chest. And I should trust you instead,
Yes,
Xander said without hesitation.
because no matter what you think of me, I have no reason to lie to you. But him?
His gaze darkened.
Ask yourself what he truly wants.
I hated the way my stomach twisted at his words. I wanted to dismiss them, to throw them back in his face, but a seed of doubt had already been planted. I already knew that Xander was hinting towards Benjamin. I lifted my chin. You think you can manipulate me into seeing things your way? Xander sighed again, running a hand through his dark hair.
I think
He said slowly,
that you are smarter than that, and that, given time, you will understand who is truly on your side.
I shook my head. You're wasting your time. His eyes softened just a fraction.
Number, I am giving you time.
I gritted my teeth. If you actually cared about me, you would let me go. Xander's expression remained unreadable.
If I let you go now, Serafina, you would walk straight into a death trap.
I stared at him, my heart pounding. Then tell me what exactly is so dangerous out there. Xander studied me for a long moment before he spoke.
Betrayal.
He said simply. I felt my pulse spike. Betrayal by who? He smiled faintly.
That, my dear, is for you to discover.
I clenched my fists. You're playing games,
No,
he corrected.
I am giving you a choice. Stay in this fortress where I can keep you safe, or leave and find out the truth the hard way.
I glared at him. You mean, stay in my prison or walk into your trap? Xander's smile faded.
You think so little of me.
You've given me no reason to think otherwise, I snapped. He sighed, stepping back toward the door.
One day, Serafina, you will look back on this moment and realize I was never your enemy.
I lifted my chin. Get out. And then I realized that it was Xander's fortress. I cannot say him like that. Then I expected that Xander will take some brutal actions against me, but surprisingly, Xander smiled. Xander held my gaze for another long moment before nodding slightly.
As you wish.
And with that, he turned and walked out, leaving me standing in the silence of my so-called sanctuary, my thoughts tangled in his words. I sat on the edge of the small wooden bed, my fingers tracing over the rough blanket as I waited. Xander had left a few minutes ago, his words still ringing in my ears.
Don't trust him. Not everyone appears the same as they are in real, Serafina.
He didn't say Benjamin's name, but we both knew who he meant. I had only met Benjamin a few times now, and each time he had been kind, supportive, understanding. Everything Xander wasn't. Yet, Xander's dark eyes had searched mine with something close to warning. Was it concern, jealousy, or just another mind game? I had no intention of letting Xander get into my head, not when I finally had a way out. A soft knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. I stood up, smoothing the creases of my dress before walking over. When I pulled it open, Benjamin was standing there, a warm smile on his face.
Hope I'm not interrupting.
He said lightly, stepping inside as if he belonged here. Not at all, I replied, closing the door behind him. Benjamin always carried an air of ease, like he had everything under control. His dark brown hair was slightly tousled, as if he had just come in from a long ride, and his sharp features softened when he smiled. He wasn't as intense as Xander. His presence didn't suffocate the air in the room. Instead, it felt like he offered an escape.
How are you holding up?
He asked, crossing his arms as he leaned against the wall. I let out a small breath. Like a bird with clipped wings. His expression darkened slightly.
That's exactly why we need to get you out of here.
He stepped closer, his voice quieter now.
Xander isn't your friend, Serafina. You know that, right?
I swallowed, choosing my words carefully. He saved me from the raid. Benjamin scoffed.
He saved you so he could own you.
I looked away. He wasn't wrong. Xander kept me locked in this place like I was his possession, his property to guard. Benjamin reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against my wrist.
I know you don't belong here, and I can help you escape.
My breath hitched, but I kept my face still. He had said it before, but this time, it felt real. How? When? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. His lips curved into a small, knowing smile.
Leave that to me.
For the first time in weeks, a spark of hope flickered in my chest. The next day was all about mind games. Xander was trying to warn me about Benjamin, and Benjamin was trying to warn me about Xander. But deep inside my mind, Benjamin was better because he at least wanted to help me out. Dinner was a silent affair. Xander sat at the head of the table, his presence weighing heavier than the food on my plate. His sharp jaw was clenched as he ate, his golden eyes flicking to me every few moments, watching, studying. Benjamin sat across from me, relaxed as ever. He didn't seem bothered by Xander's gaze. If anything, he seemed amused.
So, Serafina?
Xander said suddenly, his voice smooth but edged with something else.
You've been spending a lot of time with Benjamin.
I glanced up, forcing a neutral expression. He's been good company. Xander's eyes narrowed slightly.
That's so?
Benjamin chuckled.
What, worried I might steal her away?
A tense silence stretched between them. I gripped my fork, trying to appear unaffected. The air crackled with unspoken words. Xander leaned back in his chair, tilting his head slightly.
Serafina isn't some prize to steal, Benjamin. She is my mate.
Of course.
Benjamin replied smoothly.
But she's a woman who deserves freedom. Something you don't seem too keen on giving her.
Xander roaring.
What did you say?
Benjamin seemed to be little scared this time. Xander was the alpha, the powerful werewolf, the strongest, Benjamin said.
I am sorry, my alpha.
But the way Benjamin replied, it was clear that Benjamin didn't have any respect from his heart. It was like a formality. I held my breath, waiting for Xander's response, but he didn't take the bait. Instead, he looked at me.
Do you trust him?
The question came so suddenly that I almost faltered, but I held my gaze steady and gave him the answer I knew he didn't want to hear. Yes. Something flickered in his expression, but he masked it quickly. He set his knife down with slow, deliberate movements.
Good.
The word sat heavy in my stomach, but I forced a smile. I'll take my chances. Xander watched me a moment longer before pushing back his chair.
Enjoy your evening,
he said, standing up. And just like that, he was gone. Benjamin smirked, shaking his head as he reached for his drink.
He really doesn't like me.
He doesn't trust you, I corrected. Benjamin lifted his glass in a mock toast.
And do you?
I met his gaze, my fingers tightening slightly on my fork. Yes, I lied, because trust was a dangerous thing, and right now, Xander wasn't the only one playing a game. I sat by the window, staring out at the moonlit courtyard below. Benjamin stood beside me, his voice low as he laid out the plan.
There's a hidden passage beneath the north wing,
he explained.
It leads out beyond the walls, straight into the forest.
I listened carefully, memorizing every detail. He spoke with confidence, with certainty. It was comforting. But Xander will expect me to run, I murmured. Benjamin's lips curved.
That's why we're not running tonight.
I blinked, caught off guard. He leaned in slightly, his voice just above a whisper.
He's watching you too closely. We wait. Let him think you're settling in. And when he least expects it...
We're gone, I finished. Benjamin smiled, and for a moment it felt like I had an ally, a friend, someone who saw me as more than just a possession or a pawn.
You don't deserve this, Serafina.
His voice was softer now, almost gentle.
I'll get you out of here.
I should have been more skeptical. I should have questioned why he cared so much. But after everything, after Xander's suffocating control, I wanted to believe him. I reached out, placing my hand over his. Thank you. His fingers curled slightly, holding mine for just a second longer than necessary. Then he pulled away, stepping back.
Get some rest.
He murmured.
We'll need it.
I watched as he disappeared into the hallway, my mind spinning with possibilities. Xander thought he had me under control. He thought I was still playing by his rules. But soon, I'd be gone. And this time, no one would stop me. The flickering candlelight danced across the stone walls of my room, casting eerie shadows that seemed to whisper of danger. The fortress was quiet. Too quiet. Even the usual sounds of guards patrolling the hallways had faded into an unnatural stillness. And then, a soft knock. My breath hitched as I turned sharply, my heart racing against my ribs. The door didn't open immediately, but I knew who it was. No one else would dare come here at this hour. Another knock, this time, lighter, almost hesitant. I rushed toward the door and pressed my ear against the wood. "Benjamin?" I whispered. A pause, then his low voice.
It's me. Let me in.
Fumbling with the latch, I unlocked the door and pulled it open just enough to see his face. His sharp brown eyes flickered with urgency, his dark hair slightly tousled as if he had run here. He looked over his shoulder once before slipping inside and shutting the door behind him.
You're ready?
He whispered. I swallowed hard, my hands clenching at my sides. You're sure about this? His jaw tightened.
We don't have much time. It's now or never, Serafina.
I nodded, even though my mind was twisting. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for, dreading, dreaming of. If we were caught, I wouldn't get another chance. Benjamin leaned in slightly.
Do you trust me?
I hesitated. Did I? Could I? Xander's words still lingered in my mind, his warning about betrayal, about my own people being the real danger. But I shook the doubt away. Xander was the one who kept me locked up. Xander was the one who had stolen my freedom. Benjamin was my only way out. Yes, I whispered, I trust you. His lips twitched into a brief, relieved smile.
Then let's move.
Stepping into the shadows. He cracked the door open just enough to peek outside. I held my breath as he scanned the hallway, his shoulders tense. After a few seconds, he turned back to me and nodded.
Clear.
Silently, I stepped out of my room, my bare feet barely making a sound against the cold stone floor. The air was thick with tension, each step feeling heavier than the last. Benjamin moved ahead of me, his movements swift and precise. He knew this fortress well, better than I did. He had memorized the patrol routes, the blind spots, the hidden passages. I followed him as we made our way down the dimly lit hall, my pulse pounding in my ears. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the torches on the walls made my heart jump. As we reached the first hall, Benjamin pressed a hand against my arm, stopping me.
Wait.
His voice was barely a whisper. He peeked around the corner, his body stiff. I could hear footsteps in the distance, slow, methodical, but growing fainter. My breath caught in my throat. Please don't turn this way. Please don't turn this way. After a few agonizing seconds, Benjamin exhaled quietly and turned back to me.
We're good. Let's go.
We slipped through the hall like shadows, moving quickly but carefully. Every second felt stretched, every movement calculated. The air smelled of damp stone and burning torches, but beneath it, I could smell something else. Freedom. I wasn't going to stop until I reached it, through the halls of uncertainty. By the time we reached the second hall, I felt a trickle of sweat run down my back. The silence was deafening, and the weight of what we were doing pressed against my chest. Benjamin glanced back at me.
You okay?
I nodded quickly. Just keep moving. He smirked slightly.
I like your attitude.
We moved again, slipping past another set of doors, creeping along the shadows of the walls. Every so often, Benjamin would stop, listen, and then wave me forward. We were close. When we reached the third hall, Benjamin suddenly froze. My heart nearly stopped. What? I whispered, barely daring to breathe. He didn't answer at first. His eyes were locked on something down the hall. I followed his gaze, and my stomach dropped. A guard, standing right by the entrance to the next passage. Panic surged through me, but Benjamin was already moving. He grabbed my wrist and pulled me back into a dark alcove just as the guard shifted. For a long, agonizing moment we stood there, pressed against the cold stone, my body tense beside Benjamin's. I could feel the warmth of his breath on my cheek, hear the steady rhythm of his breathing. Then, movement. The guard let out a sigh, turned, and began walking in the opposite direction. Benjamin exhaled slowly.
That was close.
"No kidding," I muttered. He chuckled softly, then tilted his head toward the passage.
Let's move.
We slipped past the empty post and continued our way down the final stretch of halls. My heart hammered harder with every step. And then, finally, we saw it. The north wing. I almost couldn't believe it. The heavy iron doors stood before us just as planned. This was the final step. One push, and we would be outside the fortress walls. Benjamin turned to me, a victorious grin on his face.
We made it.
A breathless laugh escaped me. We actually did. I hadn't felt this light in. I don't even know how long. The walls of this fortress had suffocated me, but now I could taste the night air just beyond those doors. Benjamin pressed his palm against the door, testing it.
It's unlocked,
He whispered.
just like I told you.
For the first time in what felt like forever, I let myself believe. We were escaping. We were free.
On 3,
Benjamin said.
we pushed together.
I nodded, my fingers curling into fists, my heart hammering wildly.
1,
The air felt electric. 2. My pulse raced.
3.
We shoved against the doors, and everything changed. Benjamin moved first, gripping the handle and pushing it open. A gust of cool night air swept in, brushing against my skin like an unspoken promise. I stepped forward. And then everything fell apart. A sudden force slammed into Benjamin, knocking him backward before he could react. A sharp gasp tore from my lips as a figure emerged from the shadows, swift and merciless. Xander. His golden eyes locked onto mine, unreadable but burning with something I couldn't place. Behind him, several guards stood in the doorway, blocking any chance of escape. Benjamin tried to push himself up, but Xander planted a firm boot against his chest, pinning him down.
Going somewhere?
His voice was smooth, almost amused, but the steel in his gaze told a different story. I took a step back, my mind racing. Someone had betrayed us. Someone had told Xander. He had been waiting. "Let him go," I demanded, keeping my voice even. Xander glanced down at Benjamin before shifting his attention back to me.
Oh, I plan to. Right after I deal with you.
I spun to run, but before I could take a single step, arms wrapped around my waist. A guard.
Don't fight it, Serafina.
Xander murmured, stepping closer.
You lost the moment you trusted him.
The cell was colder than I expected. Thick iron bars surrounded me, the faint scent of damp stone lingering in the air. A single torch flickered on the far wall, casting jagged shadows across the floor. I sat on the small wooden bench, my fingers curled into fists. Somewhere in another room, Benjamin was caged just like me. Xander hadn't spoken a word after locking us up. He had simply turned away, leaving me here to stew in my own frustration. The sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor. I didn't have to look up to know who it was. Xander. He appeared on the other side of the bars, his expression calm, too calm. He leaned against the metal, arms crossed, watching me like I was a puzzle he hadn't quite solved.
You really thought you could leave?
He asked, tilting his head slightly. I refused to answer. His lips curved into something resembling a smile.
Tell me, Serafina, was it worth it?
A slow breath left my lips. You're not my keeper, Xander. His eyes darkened slightly.
No,
He agreed.
but I am the reason you're still alive.
I lifted my chin. You're also the reason I need to escape in the first place. For a moment, he didn't respond. Then he pushed away from the bars, taking a step closer. The dim light flickered across his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his jaw.
Do you even know what you were running toward?
His voice was quieter now, but no less intense. I stared at him, refusing to let him see the doubt creeping in.
You think Benjamin is your savior?
He continued.
That he'll take you far away from all of this?
He would have, I said, keeping my voice steady. Xander's gaze lingered on mine.
And yet, you didn't even see the trap coming.
I clenched my teeth, because someone betrayed us. His lips twitched, as if the answer was right in front of me and I was too blind to see it. My hands tightened around the edge of the bench. It wasn't him. Xander exhaled softly, shaking his head.
You're smarter than this, Serafina.
I stood abruptly, walking to the bars until only inches separated us. And you're crueler than I realized. Something flickered in his expression, but it was gone before I could name it.
I could have let them destroy you.
He said, voice quieter now.
But I didn't.
I held his gaze. Then why lock me away? Xander didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached through the bars, his fingers brushing against the loose strands of my hair. It was a fleeting touch, barely there, but it sent a strange warmth through my skin.
Because if you run again,
he murmured.
I won't be the one to find you.
I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry.
But someone will.
He continued, his voice softer but no less threatening.
And trust me, Serafina, they won't be as forgiving as I am.
A lump formed in my throat, but I forced myself to stand my ground. You act like you care. His jaw tensed slightly.
I don't have to care to keep you alive.
The silence between us stretched. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. I stood there long after he was gone, my mind whirling. Xander was many things: controlling, dangerous, impossible to predict. But one thing was certain. He wasn't done with me yet, and I wasn't done fighting. The stone walls were cold against my back. The silence in my cell stretched long and unbearable, broken only by the occasional drip of water from the cracks in the ceiling. I hadn't seen Benjamin since we were dragged apart, and that uncertainty gnawed at me like a dull knife scraping against my ribs. Then footsteps. Steady, unhurried, calculated. Xander. The iron door groaned as it swung open, revealing him in the doorway. He didn't step inside. He didn't need to. His presence alone filled the room, thick with unspoken authority. His gaze locked onto mine, assessing, dissecting, searching for weakness like a predator who already knew its prey had nowhere left to run.
Comfortable?
His voice was a quiet threat, smooth and edged with something unreadable. I lifted my chin. You know, for a man who claims to be powerful, locking up a woman in a cell seems beneath you. A ghost of a smirk touched his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes.
Oh, Serafina, if I wanted you truly locked away, you wouldn't be in a place with a door. You'd be in the ground.
I stared on him, keeping my expression indifferent, even as my pulse quickened. He took a slow step forward, his boots scuffing against the stone.
You tried to escape.
He continued, voice calm, almost conversational.
With Benjamin, no less. A man you barely know. And yet, you trusted him enough to run into the unknown?
I folded my arms, leaning against the cold wall. Maybe I just wanted to get away from you. Something flickered across his face, something unreadable.
Then you must be feeling rather disappointed right now.
Silence stretched between us. I refused to look away, even as he studied me like I was some intricate puzzle he was deciding whether to solve or shatter. Then he sighed, almost as if I had exhausted his patience.
Benjamin?
He said, tilting his head slightly.
What did he offer you, Serafina? Freedom? Safety?
I didn't answer. Xander took another step forward. This time, he was close enough that I could see the faint scar on his jaw, the way the torchlight danced over the sharp angles of his face. His scent, earthy, like pine and something darker, filled the space between us.
You think he cares about you?
His voice dipped lower, dangerously soft.
Or did you just cling to the first person who whispered sweet promises in your ear?
I clenched my fists. He wanted to help me, unlike you. Xander exhaled a quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it.
Help you?
His head tilted, eyes sharp as daggers.
You think he would risk everything for you just because he's a kind soul?
He stepped even closer, forcing me against the wall.
Or maybe he had his own reasons, ones he never bothered to share with you.
My stomach burned with frustration, but I forced my expression to remain neutral. He was testing me, trying to plant seeds of doubt. You don't know him, I shot back. Not like I do.
Don't I?
Xander's voice was barely above a whisper, his breath warm against my skin.
I know men like Benjamin. They say all the right things, promise the impossible, and then, when it's time to prove their loyalty, they vanish.
I pressed my lips together, refusing to let his words shake me. But a tiny part of me, it was listening. Xander studied me for a long moment before he took a step back, as if he'd already said enough.
Here's the thing, Serafina.
He murmured, slipping his hands behind his back.
I could have finished him the moment I found you both. I could have dragged his body in here, let you see exactly what betrayal earns a man under my rule.
My throat tightened. But you didn't.
No,
Xander agreed.
I didn't.
I hated that my breath came a little faster. Why? He leaned against the doorframe, watching me with unsettling patience.
Because I wanted to give you a choice.
I frowned. A choice?
You'll obey me.
His voice was cool, steady.
You'll stop these foolish escape attempts, and in return, I'll let him live.
My fingers curled against my arms. And if I don't? Xander's jaw twitched, his eyes turning unreadable.
Then he dies.
The words dropped like stones in my chest. I wanted to fight, to argue, but deep down I knew this was no bluff. Xander wasn't a man who made empty threats. I exhaled through my nose, forcing myself to appear unaffected. You're asking me to be your prisoner with a prettier name. His expression remained unreadable.
I'm asking you to be smart.
My nails pressed into my skin. I glanced past him, towards the hallway beyond the door. Freedom was right there, just a few steps away. But it might as well have been an ocean apart. If I wanted to keep Benjamin alive, I had only one choice. Fine, I said, keeping my voice even. I'll play by your rules. Xander's eyes lingered on me for a beat too long, as if searching for something beneath my words. Then, he pushed off the wall and turned towards the door.
Good,
He said,
then let's see if you can keep up the act.
and with that, he walked away, leaving me alone in the silence of my own making. The next morning, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my reflection in the polished silver mirror across the room. My face was unreadable, carefully arranged into something soft, something willing. It had to be convincing. A soft knock at the door. I inhaled sharply, pressing my hands against my lap to keep them from clenching. Then, with practiced ease, I shifted my expression. Just a hint of surprise, a slight widening of my eyes, like I wasn't expecting him. Come in. The door opened, and there he was. Xander stepped inside, his dark shirt unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves pushed up to his elbows. His usual rigid stance was absent. Instead, he leaned against the doorframe, watching me with something careful, almost hesitant. That was new.
Couldn't sleep?
His voice was softer than usual. I let my gaze drop, tucking a loose strand of hair behind my ear. I guess not. A slow silence stretched between us, thick with something unspoken. Then, instead of ordering me to talk or demanding I listen, he crossed the room and set something down on the nightstand beside me. A tray. I blinked, caught off guard. What is this? I asked. Xander shrugged.
You barely touched your dinner earlier.
I glanced down, slices of fruit, warm bread, a small bowl of stew. Nothing extravagant, but thoughtful, more than I expected from him. I let my fingers trail along the edge of the wooden tray, not touching the food just yet. This was different. This wasn't the Xander who had locked me away, who had ordered me around like I was nothing more than a captured pawn in his game. This was a man trying, and that made it dangerous. I had spent the last few days carefully, painstakingly crafting my next move. Benjamin was still here somewhere, locked away, waiting for me. I had to get to him, and for that, I needed Xander to believe I was changing. I needed him to believe I was softening. Slowly, deliberately, I picked up a piece of fruit and took a small bite. Sweet. Ripe. Xander exhaled, as if he had been holding his breath waiting for me to reject it. "You don't have to do this," I murmured, keeping my voice just light enough to make it seem like I was teasing. "Bringing me food, acting like you—" I let the sentence drift, unfinished, waiting to see how he'd react. He didn't take the bait. Instead, he pulled the chair from the corner of the room and sat down across from me. Not too close, not too far.
"I know you don't trust me,"
he said. A statement, not a question. I tilted my head slightly, studying him. "And you think bringing me food is going to change that?"
"No,
he admitted, rubbing a hand along his jaw. He hesitated, exhaling sharply.
I don't want to force you into anything, Serafina. Not anymore."
That was unexpected. I kept my expression carefully neutral, but inside, something shifted. Xander wasn't demanding. He wasn't trying to manipulate me into obedience. He was, what? Offering me a choice? Number that would be too easy. And yet, the way he looked at me, like he was trying to figure out how to bridge the impossible distance between us, made it hard to ignore. I set the piece of fruit down and leaned back slightly, just enough to make it seem like I was considering his words. "Then why am I still locked in this room every night?" I asked. His jaw tensed.
"For your safety."
I let out a quiet laugh. "For my safety. Right."
"You don't understand what's out there."
I met his gaze evenly. "Then let me see for myself." Xander inhaled, slow and measured. I could see the war in his expression, the way his mind was calculating risks, weighing what he could afford to lose. Finally, he said,
"You can walk the fortress freely."
I blinked, caught off guard for the first time. "What?"
"No more locked doors.
he said, watching my reaction closely.
You can go where you want. Make your own choices."
For a split second, I forgot to breathe. Was this a trick? Some elaborate test to see if I would run? Or was this something else? Something real? I let a small smile, hesitant, unsure, curve my lips, just enough to make it believable. "Why?" I whispered. Xander leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees.
"Because I want you to stay with me by choice, Serafina. Not because I forced you to."
His voice was steady, firm. And that was the most dangerous part of all. Because if I hadn't known better, I might have believed him. I lowered my gaze, letting my fingers trace the rim of the bowl in front of me. "I don't know if I can do that." Xander didn't move, didn't demand anything. He just nodded.
"Then I'll wait."
A pause, a heartbeat of silence that settled in my chest like something heavy. I swallowed, forcing warmth into my voice, just enough to make it seem like I was breaking. "Thank you." 2 simple words. But the way Xander's expression softened, the way something in his shoulders eased, told me that they meant something to him. He thought he was winning. He thought I was finally looking at him differently. And that's exactly what I needed him to believe. I reached for another piece of fruit, my fingers brushing lightly against the tray. "So, no more guards trailing me everywhere?" I asked, keeping my tone light. Xander's lips twitched.
"Let's not get ahead of ourselves."
I let out a small laugh, soft, careful, like I was letting my guard down. He was falling for it. Good, because the second I found Benjamin, the second I had a real chance, I was gone. I walked through the dim hallway, my wrists still raw from where they had been bound the night before. Xander had left me alone after locking me back in my quarters, but it didn't matter. The four walls around me might as well have been iron bars. I needed to get out of here. Benjamin was somewhere in this fortress, locked away like an animal because of me. I had no idea where he was, no idea how to fix this, but one thing was certain. I wasn't going to sit here and play the part of the obedient captive forever. For days, I had followed their rules. I ate the food they brought, kept my head down, let Xander believe I was breaking. But I wasn't stupid. Any sign of defiance would only make things worse, so I played along, waiting for the right moment. And then the moment found me first. It happened when I least expected it. A rare privilege, I had been allowed outside the fortress walls. A guard trailed behind me, his boots crunching against the dry earth, but I barely noticed. For the first time in days, I could breathe. The sun hung low in the sky, staining everything gold. The air smelled of dry leaves and something wild, something untamed. For a brief second, I let myself believe I was free. And then I heard it. A low growl. I turned sharply, my pulse kicking up as I spotted them. 3 figures at the tree line, their eyes glinting in the fading light. Werewolves. Not Xander's men. Their scent was different. Wild, unrestrained. Rogues. I barely had time to react before they lunged. I twisted away, but one of them caught my arm, his grip bruising as he yanked me back. My boots skidded against the dirt as I struggled, clawing at his wrist. "Let me go," I snarled, twisting my body enough to drive my elbow into his ribs. He grunted, but didn't let go. Another one grabbed my hair, jerking me backward so hard my vision blurred.
"Where's your alpha now, little Luna?"
One of them sneered. I didn't answer. I was too busy fighting to break free. Then, before I could process what was happening, the air shifted. A blur of motion. A sharp yelp, a heavy thud. Silence. Xander. He stood there like something out of a nightmare, his shoulders squared, his expression unreadable. The rogue who had grabbed me was already on the ground, his body twisted unnaturally. Xander didn't hesitate. He moved like lightning, catching the second rogue by the throat and slamming him into the dirt. The third tried to run, but he didn't make it 2 steps before Xander grabbed him, twisting his arm until a sickening crack filled the air. I stood frozen, my breath coming too fast as I watched him. It was over before I could even react. Xander turned to me, his gaze sweeping over me, his jaw tight.
"You're hurt."
His voice was sharp. I shook my head. "It's nothing." He stepped closer. Too close. For the first time since meeting him, I didn't just see the monster. I saw something else. Something dangerous. Something protective. I hated the way my skin warmed where his gaze lingered. I hated the way my pulse fluttered when he reached for me, his fingers brushing against my wrist. "I had it under control," I muttered. Xander let out a quiet scoff. His grip tightened for a fraction of a second before he released me.
"Is that what you tell yourself?"
He murmured, his voice unreadable. I forced myself to hold his gaze. "I don't need you to save me." His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes.
"You're right.
He said softly.
You don't need me. But that doesn't mean I won't step in when necessary."
I clenched my fists. "You kidnapped me, Xander. Don't act like you're my savior." He tilted his head, his lips curling slightly.
"I never said I was."
My throat tightened. Because the worst part was that he was right. And I hated that more than anything. I turned away before he could see the war inside me. Xander didn't stop me, but as I walked back toward the fortress, I felt his gaze on me. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. I didn't wanted to name, but Xander was changed, or maybe he was playing tricks. I stepped into my room, I changed my dress, then I had some snacks. The room was dimly lit, the fire casting flickering shadows across the stone walls. I sat on the edge of the bed, my fingers tracing absent circles against the rough fabric of the blanket. I should have been focusing on escape, on a plan, but instead, my mind was tangled in something else. Something, or someone, I didn't want to think about. The door creaked open. Xander. He stepped inside, his expression unreadable. His dark shirt was slightly wrinkled, his sleeves rolled up, revealing the bruises that marred his forearms. He looked exhausted. I exhaled sharply. "What do you want?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned against the doorframe, studying me like he was waiting for something. I refused to break the silence first. Finally, he spoke.
Why do you always fight me?
I let out a dry laugh. "You mean aside from the fact that you kidnapped me?" He didn't flinch.
I'm not your enemy, Serafina.
"Then why do you keep acting like my protector?" I snapped, rising to my feet. He didn't move, didn't even blink.
I'm not trying to be your savior.
His voice was quiet, but there was something heavy beneath it. "Then why, Xander?" I took a step closer, daring him to lie to me. "Why do you keep protecting me?" Something flickered across his face. Something raw.
I told you.
He said.
I'm not your enemy.
"That's not an answer." Silence stretched between us. I watched him carefully, the way his hands curled into fists, the way his jaw tensed like he was holding something back.
Because I love you.
He finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words knocked the air from my lungs. I stared at him, waiting for him to take it back, to say he didn't mean it. But he didn't. Instead, he exhaled, running a hand through his hair like he hated himself for saying it. "You hardly know me," I whispered. A humorless chuckle escaped him.
That's where you're wrong.
I swallowed hard, my heart racing for an entirely different reason now. "You think this is love?" My voice wavered. "Keeping me here like a prisoner?" Xander's gaze darkened.
You don't know what's out there, Serafina. You don't know the dangers waiting for you the second you leave these walls.
I shook my head. "You don't get to decide what's best for me."
I do when your life is at risk.
His voice was steady, but I caught the way his fingers twitched, like he was resisting the urge to reach for me. I should have been angry. I should have hated him for thinking he had any right to control my life, but instead, all I could hear was the way he had said it. "I love you." I sucked in a shaky breath, then let me go. Xander didn't look away, didn't move, and that silence told me everything. This wasn't about power. It wasn't about control. Xander wasn't keeping me here because he wanted to. He was keeping me here because he was afraid of what would happen if he let me go. And that terrified me more than anything else. That night was restless. My mind was unable to move on from thoughts about Xander and Benjamin. I sat near the window, my fingers tracing meaningless patterns against the glass, lost in my own thoughts. Xander had been different since the attack. Not softer exactly, but something had shifted. There was a quietness in the way he looked at me, as if he was waiting for something. I wasn't used to that. I was used to men wanting, taking, demanding, but Xander, despite his strength, his control, was holding back, and I didn't know why. The door creaked open, and I already knew it was him before I turned around. His presence filled the space in a way that was impossible to ignore.
You're awake.
He observed, his gaze settling on me. I glanced at him. He had changed out of his usual dark cloak, wearing a simple white shirt rolled up at the sleeves, exposing his forearms. His hair was slightly tousled, as if he had run his fingers through it one too many times. "I don't sleep much," I admitted. Xander leaned against the doorframe, watching me.
Because you don't feel safe here?
I didn't answer. He let out a slow breath before stepping closer, pulling out the chair across from me. I expected him to sit, but he remained standing, his fingers drumming lightly against the backrest.
I've given you no reason to trust me.
He said, as if reading my mind.
But I also haven't hurt you.
"Not yet," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. His lips pressed into a thin line.
But soon you will, Serafina.
I forced myself to hold his gaze. "You keep saying that." He was silent for a moment. Then he shifted his weight slightly, his stance still composed, but something about him seemed hesitant.
You have a choice.
He said finally.
Stay here. Be my mate, not by force, not by duty, but because you want to. I won't make that decision for you. You have to decide on your own.
Something in my chest tightened at his words. I hadn't expected that. I knew how these things worked. Alpha wolves didn't ask. They took. They claimed. But Xander was giving me a choice. I swallowed, gripping the fabric of my dress. And if I say no? A shadow crossed his face.
Then you say no.
Just like that, no threats, no ultimatums. I should have felt relieved, but instead I felt trapped in an entirely different way. I looked away, staring down at my lap. I need time. His expression remained unreadable, but I saw the way his jaw tensed.
Time.
Yes, I said firmly. This isn't something I can answer right now. A long silence stretched between us. Then, with a slight incline of his head, he turned and walked toward the door. Before leaving, he paused, his voice quieter this time.
Take all the time you need.
And just like that, he was gone. I asked myself, Xander is villain, right? But why is pretending not to be? What is the trick behind it? Then the evening passed as soon as it arrived. I was busy in my thoughts. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because of Xander's offer, not because of the confusing pull I felt toward him, but because I had a plan. I waited until the castle was silent, the only sounds the distant howl of wolves and the occasional footsteps of the guards outside. I had spent days memorizing their shifts, watching the way they moved, learning which hallways were left unguarded for the longest stretches of time. Now it was time to put that knowledge to use. I slipped on a cloak, keeping the hood low over my face, and pressed my back against the wall, waiting. 3, 2, 1. I moved fast, keeping to the shadows, slipping past the guards exactly when I knew they would change shifts. My pulse was steady, my breathing controlled. When I reached the lower chambers, I paused, listening. Silence. I exhaled and stepped forward. The dungeons were cold, the air thick with damp stone and iron. My fingers curled into fists as I approached the last cell, peering inside. Benjamin. He was sitting on the floor, his head tilted back against the wall, eyes closed. The bruises on his wrists stood out against his pale skin. Benjamin, I whispered. His eyes snapped open, and for a second he just stared at me. Then recognition hit, and he was on his feet in an instant.
Serafina!
Quiet, I hissed, pulling the keys from my cloak. His hands curled around the iron bars.
You're really here.
Of course I am, I said, working the lock. It clicked open, and I pulled the door wide, stepping aside. Come on, we don't have much time. He hesitated for only a second before stepping out, rubbing his wrists.
How did you...
Later, I interrupted. Move. We moved quickly through the corridors, retracing my steps, careful not to make a sound. The exit was close. I could see the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the cracks in the wooden doors. Then, voices. I grabbed Benjamin's arm, shoving us both against the wall, pressing myself as close to the shadows as possible. The guards passed without noticing us. A few more steps. The door was right there. I pushed it open and we slipped outside. The night air hit me first, cool and crisp, filling my lungs. Benjamin grabbed my hand.
Come on, I have a place we can go.
I didn't ask where. I just ran. By the time we reached the outskirts of the forest, my legs burned and my breath was uneven. Benjamin slowed, glancing at me.
We're almost there.
I followed him deeper into the trees, my boots sinking into the soft earth. Then, through the thick canopy, I saw it, a large stone house, half hidden by the dense forest. Benjamin stepped forward and knocked twice on the heavy wooden door. The door creaked open, and then I froze. Standing in the doorway, his arms crossed, was my father. For a moment, we just stared at each other. His face was exactly as I remembered, sharp features, piercing gaze, a presence that commanded attention.
You're late,
he said finally, his voice calm. Benjamin let out a breath.
We ran into some trouble.
My eyes darted between them. You know each other? My father glanced at me, then back at Benjamin.
Of course we do.
A strange sensation curled in my chest, something close to betrayal. "You planned this," I accused, my voice barely above a whisper. Benjamin met my gaze, something unreadable in his eyes.
We both did.
My father stepped aside, motioning toward the house.
Come inside, Serafina. We have much to discuss.
I hesitated. Then slowly I stepped forward, crossing the threshold. And as the door shut behind me, I realized whatever I had just walked into was far bigger than I had ever imagined. My father's hands were gentle as he pressed a damp cloth to my forehead, his voice smooth, reassuring.
You'll feel a little weak, but that's normal.
He said, his gaze warm, caring. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. I was tired, mentally, emotionally. After everything, I just wanted to be safe. But something wasn't right. I felt it in the way my body reacted. My limbs were sluggish, my thoughts slower than usual. The room around me, dimly lit by flickering lanterns, seemed distorted. Time moved strangely, like I was caught between being awake and dreaming.
You're doing great.
My father continued, brushing my hair back, his touch light.
This is for your own good, Serafina. I would never do anything to hurt you.
Wouldn't he? A strange sensation spread through me, something unfamiliar yet oddly familiar, like a memory clawing its way to the surface. I had felt this before. I didn't know when, but I knew this wasn't the first time. Why do I feel like this? My voice was barely above a whisper. Benjamin appeared beside my father, his expression unreadable.
Your body needs time to adjust.
He said.
You've been through a lot.
Adjust to what? I forced myself to sit up, pushing against the weight of my own exhaustion. What are you giving me?
Just something to help.
My father said smoothly, his fingers brushing over my wrist.
You've been under too much stress, Serafina. You need to rest.
Rest. That word sat uneasily inside me. It felt less like a suggestion and more like a command. I glanced at my arm, catching a faint mark on my skin. A tiny puncture. My breath hitched. They had injected something into me. I swallowed the rising panic. "Father," I said carefully, "what are you doing to me?" His smile was calm, patient.
Helping you become what you were meant to be.
A sickening feeling settled inside me. Become what? I looked at Benjamin, searching for something in his face. Guilt, remorse, hesitation, anything. But there was nothing. He just stared at me, his posture relaxed, unaffected. I pulled my arm away. "I don't need help." My father chuckled.
Of course you do. You've been lied to your whole life. You don't know what's best for you, my dear, but I do. I've always known.
A memory flashed, his hands on my shoulders when I was a child, his voice firm, shaping my thoughts, my beliefs.
Werewolves are monsters, Serafina. They can't be trusted. They destroyed your ancestors. They don't feel like humans. They don't love like humans.
I just remembered those words and memories of my childhood when my father always convinced me about these things. But Xander had saved me. He had protected me when he didn't have to. I had felt something real in his presence, something I couldn't explain but couldn't deny. And now, I was sitting here, being experimented on. A chill crawled up my spine. Not from the room, but from the realization sinking in. I wasn't the victim of werewolves. I was the victim of him. "You lied to me," I whispered. "You made me believe they were the monsters." My father's expression didn't change. He sighed, rubbing his temple like I was an exhausting child.
You don't understand.
"I understand perfectly," I snapped, shoving off the blanket and forcing myself to stand. My legs felt weak, but I locked my knees, refusing to collapse in front of them. "You brainwashed me. I sucked in a sharp breath, everything connecting at once. "You hunted them. You didn't just fight against them. You slaughtered them." He didn't deny it. He just tilted his head, observing me like I was a puzzle he had put together but hadn't finished yet.
And?
Anger boiled inside me. And you used me! He exhaled slowly like he was disappointed.
I protected you.
By making me hate who I really am? My voice cracked at the end, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Silence filled the space between us. He took a step closer, his face calm, but his eyes sharp.
And what are you, Seraphina?
I swallowed, my throat tightening. My pulse quickened, my mind racing. I didn't want to say it. I didn't want to admit what I already knew, but the truth was staring at me, gripping my very existence like a vice. I'm not human, I whispered. His lips curled into a slow, satisfied smile.
No,
He murmured.
you never were.
My chest tightened, not from fear, but from the weight of everything crumbling inside me. I had spent my entire life believing I was one thing, only to find out I was something else entirely. And the worst part? He had known. He had known from the beginning. I stumbled back, my breath shallow. You experimented on me as a child, didn't you? The corners of his mouth twitched.
It was necessary.
Rage surged through me. You tortured me! His face hardened.
I saved you. I made sure you didn't become like them.
I shook my head, stepping away. You're the monster, I whispered. Not Xander, not the others. You! A dark shadow passed over his face, but before he could say anything, I turned to Benjamin. And you? I spat. You knew all along, didn't you? He met my gaze unblinking.
Yes.
I felt like I was going to be sick. I had trusted him. I had risked my life to save him. And for what? He was just another pawn in my father's game. You never cared about me, I whispered, disgust curling inside me. You were just making sure I stayed under his control. Benjamin didn't deny it. I let out a shaky breath, forcing my mind to focus. I needed to get out of here.
I have no use for a daughter who refuses to listen.
My father said, his voice colder now.
So I'll give you one last chance, Seraphina. Stay and embrace what I've built for you. Or leave and be hunted like the rest of them.
I stared at him, disbelief clawing at my throat. You destroyed me? He smiled, but there was nothing warm about it. My hands curled into fists. I wasn't his puppet anymore. I turned sharply, running toward the door. Benjamin grabbed my wrist, but I twisted out of his grip, slamming my elbow into his ribs. He grunted, stumbling back just enough for me to throw open the door and sprint down the hallway. Shouts erupted behind me, footsteps, orders. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I had wasted too much time believing in the wrong people. But he was my father. I didn't believe at first, but obviously the situation showed me the truth. I was shocked, but more hurt than ever. And Benjamin? He also betrayed me. I was trapped. I can't let them experiment on me just like I have been used in my childhood. Only one name came into my mind, Xander. Was he saying the truth? Yes, maybe. But what now? I didn't know how I was going to get back to Xander. I didn't even know if he'd help me after everything. But right now, he was the only one I could trust. And I prayed to whatever force existed in this world that I wasn't too late. The restraints dug into my wrists, cold metal pressing against my skin. My legs were bound, too, tied so tightly that every attempt to move was useless. The room smelled of antiseptic and something metallic. Blood, maybe. My blood. I had been here before. Not this exact room, but a place like it. A place where the walls hummed with the memory of my father's cruelty. Where I was nothing more than an experiment, an object to be dissected and rebuilt into something unnatural. And now, I was here again. Across the room, Benjamin stood beside my father. His golden eyes flickered under the dim light, his expression unreadable. I wanted to believe there was hesitation in him, some part of the man I once knew, but he didn't move. He didn't even blink.
Begin the next phase.
My father's voice was calm, almost casual, as if he were discussing a simple lab procedure instead of tearing apart his own daughter. I pulled at my restraints again, my muscles burning from the effort. You won't get what you want, I said, forcing steel into my voice. You never will. My father simply smiled.
We'll see.
He nodded to Benjamin. The werewolf stepped closer, a syringe glinting in his hand. I thrashed against the bed, but the bonds didn't give. I felt the prick of the needle, the slow burn as something cold seeped into my veins. My vision blurred, my limbs grew heavier, and the last thing I saw was my father's satisfied smirk before the world went dark. A dream that wasn't a dream. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't in the lab anymore. I stood in a vast, endless field. The sky above me stretched in hues of violet and deep blue, stars glittering like scattered diamonds. A soft breeze carried the scent of pine and something familiar, something warm. I turned, and there he was. Xander. His dark hair was tousled as if the wind had been playing with it, his piercing eyes watching me with an intensity that sent warmth through my chest. He looked different here, softer, almost at peace. I frowned. Where is this place? What are we doing here? Xander took a slow step toward me, his gaze locked on mine.
This isn't just a dream, Serafina. It's a place where wolves can meet their mates or those they share a deep connection with.
I let out a short laugh, shaking my head. But I'm not a werewolf. He stepped very close, almost touching my ears through his lips. I was paused. I felt his breathing from my ears. He was too close. I thought he may kiss me in cheeks or something like that, but then he tilted his head slightly, watching me.
Aren't you?
The air between us shifted. His words settled into my bones, and something in me stirred, something I had always ignored, something that had always felt off inside me. The experiments, the pain, the unnatural strength I sometimes felt but could never control. Realization hit me like a crashing wave. No, I whispered, looking away from his eyes, just to make sure that if I see him, then maybe his lips could touch mine accidentally. But for the first time I felt something intimate. This feeling was good, but no time for that. Xander stepped back, his presence steady, grounding.
You are. Not by birth, but by what your father did to you.
His voice was gentle but firm.
You've had these abilities all along, but you never knew how to use them.
My breathing quickened. Then why haven't they manifested?
Because no one ever told you they were there.
His lips curved slightly.
But now that you know,
Something pulsed inside me, an ember flickering to life. I felt it now, the raw energy under my skin, the power curling at the edges of my consciousness. Xander smiled, slow and knowing. His hand reached up, fingers brushing lightly against my cheek, and before I could react, he pressed a soft kiss there. Warmth spread through me, sinking into my skin like a whisper.
now wake up.
He murmured. The dream shattered. The first spark. I woke up gasping, my body jerking against the restraints. The ceiling above me swayed for a moment before my vision cleared and reality came rushing back. The cold bed, the metal cuffs, the scent of chemicals and cruelty. I clenched my fists, remembering Xander's words. I was a werewolf. I had power. But when I tried to reach for it, nothing happened. Frustration flared hot in my chest. I focused harder, searching for that ember of energy I had felt in the dream, but it was like grasping at smoke. My body remained as it was, trapped, powerless. A slow clap echoed through the room. I turned my head, and there he was. My father stood at the foot of the bed, a glint of amusement in his eyes.
You're trying, aren't you?
His voice was smooth, like silk hiding a blade. That's good. It means the experiments worked. I refused to answer. He chuckled.
You were my finest creation, Serafina, and now it's time for the final phase.
I swallowed hard. And what's that? He walked closer, his presence suffocating.
Loyalty.
My blood ran cold.
I will implant something inside you tomorrow.
He continued, as if he were discussing a mere medical procedure.
A final modification that will make you complete.
What does that mean? My voice was steady, but my fingers dug into the sheets.
It means
My father leaned down, his breath ghosting over my skin.
That once it's done, you will obey me, without hesitation, without question. You will serve me as you were always meant to.
Fear knotted in my chest, but I didn't let it show. And if I refuse? He smiled.
You won't.
And with that, he turned and left, leaving only the sound of my own breath in the sterile room. The dream that changed everything. That night, I found myself back in the same place. Xander stood there waiting, his arms crossed over his chest. His expression was unreadable. I failed, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. His brows drew together.
What happened?
I told him everything, about my father's plan, about the thing he wanted to put inside me, about how I had tried, really tried, to use my powers but couldn't. Xander listened without interrupting, his gaze never leaving mine. When I finished, he exhaled, then took a step forward.
You're not failing.
He said firmly.
You're learning.
It doesn't feel like that, I muttered. He lifted his hand, palm up.
Give me your hand.
I hesitated.
Trust me.
He murmured. I replied with little hesitation, I trust you. I placed my hand in his, and the moment our skin touched, something clicked inside me. A rush of warmth, a surge of something ancient and raw.
Close your eyes,
He instructed.
and feel it.
I did. This time I didn't fight it. I let the power rise, let it coil through my veins like liquid fire. My senses sharpened. The world around me pulsed with energy. Xander's voice was a steady anchor.
Now control it. Make it yours.
I focused, shaping the power, feeling it respond to me. It was there. It had always been there. I just needed to believe in it. Xander let go of my hand, a satisfied gleam in his eyes.
You're getting it.
I exhaled sharply. Not enough.
Then practice.
I opened my eyes, meeting his gaze. I don't have time.
Make time.
His voice softened.
You have until tomorrow, Serafina. Don't waste it.
And then, like before, he turned and walked away. I woke up with a purpose. My wrists ached, my legs throbbed, but I didn't care. I started practicing. At first, nothing happened, but I kept going, over and over, feeling for that ember, coaxing it, shaping it. I wasn't perfect, but I was getting there. And tomorrow, I was going to escape, no matter what it took. The cold walls of my father's laboratory felt like they were closing in on me. The air smelled of antiseptic and old books, the same scent that had haunted my childhood nightmares. The metal cuffs around my wrists had left deep red marks, but I didn't feel them anymore. My mind was somewhere else, stuck between memories and the realization that I had been nothing more than a tool in my father's experiments. And now I wasn't alone. I had my powers. Or so I thought. My legs ached from being bound for too long, but I didn't care about the pain. I had waited for this moment, studied every knot, every little weakness. And now, it was time to act. I took a slow breath, keeping my body still. My father had just left the room and Benjamin was somewhere nearby. They thought I was helpless. They thought I was their experiment, their prisoner. They were wrong. I twisted my wrists, feeling the give in the rope. The more I moved, the looser it became. My father's arrogance had blinded him. He hadn't tied the knots properly, not realizing that my body was stronger than before. I wasn't just human anymore. Xander had told me the truth. I was a werewolf, and now I was going to use every ounce of that power. With one final tug, the rope snapped. My hands were free. I wasted no time pulling at the bindings around my ankles, my fingers working fast. My pulse raced, but I forced myself to stay calm. This wasn't just about me. This was about escaping, about making sure my father never controlled me again. I swung my legs off the bed, landing softly on the cold floor. My body felt stiff, but I couldn't afford hesitation. I crept toward the door, pressing my ear against the wood. Silence. Good. I eased the door open and stepped into the dimly lit hallway. The fortress was eerily quiet, but I knew better. This place was never empty. I needed to move fast. Then,
Going somewhere?
I barely had time to turn before my father's voice sliced through the silence. He stood at the end of the hall, arms crossed, a cruel smile tugging at his lips. He wasn't surprised to see me free. If anything, he looked amused.
You always were a fighter,
He mused, taking a slow step forward.
but you're still thinking like a human. Do you really believe you can walk out of here?
I clenched my fists. Watch me. And then I moved. I darted forward, closing the distance between us in a flash. His eyes widened, but he recovered quickly. He swung at me, but I ducked, slipping past him and slamming my elbow into his ribs. He staggered back. He fell down with a grunt, but his reaction was instant. His hand shot out but couldn't grab my wrist. I turned to run, but then a blur of movement, a snarl. Benjamin. He was already shifting before my eyes, bones snapping, fur sprouting. Within seconds, the man was gone, and in his place stood a massive black wolf, eyes gleaming with predatory hunger. He lunged. I barely dodged, throwing myself to the side as his claws slashed through the air where my face had been. I hit the ground hard, but rolled to my feet, breathing heavy. Benjamin turned, circling me, his growl rumbling deep in his chest. He was fast, strong, and I was still figuring out what I was. But I didn't have time to doubt myself. When he leaped at me again, I didn't run. I met him head-on. I ducked under his attack, twisting my body and driving my fist into his chest. He yelped but recovered quickly, snapping his jaws at me. I threw my arm up just in time, blocking the bite, but his weight sent me crashing to the floor. I gasped, struggling beneath him. His teeth hovered inches from my throat, saliva dripping onto my skin. I shoved against him, legs kicking, but he was too heavy. I needed to be stronger. I squeezed my eyes shut, searching for that hidden power, the one Xander had told me about. If I could just... Heat rushed through my veins. Benjamin yelped and jerked back as if he'd been burned. I didn't know what I had done, but I didn't stop to figure it out. I scrambled to my feet and ran. The hall blurred as I sprinted, my bare feet hitting the stone floor. I didn't look back. I could hear him chasing me, his claws clicking against the ground, closing the distance. But I saw my exit, a door, just a few more steps. I reached for the handle. And then, hands grabbed me. Not Benjamin. Others, strong, overpowering. I thrashed, kicked, screamed, but it was too late. More hands joined in, forcing me to the ground. My cheek pressed against the cold stone as someone wrenched my arms behind my back. I struggled, but it was useless. My escape had failed, and now I was truly trapped. A distant boom shook the floor beneath me. The guards outside my vision shouted in panic, their boots thundering down the hall. My pulse quickened, eyes snapping to the steel door as the chaos outside grew louder, clashing metal, screams, and a voice I recognized. Xander. Another loud crash, and then... The door ripped from its hinges, slamming into the far wall. Smoke and dust swirled through the air, and through it he emerged, tall, wild, unstoppable. Xander's golden eyes scanned the room, locking onto mine. His chest rose and fell with deep, controlled breaths, his muscles tense beneath his torn black shirt. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of him. For the first time, I wanted him here.
I'm getting you out of here.
He said, his voice edged with rage. Before I could speak, a blur of movement rushed behind him. Benjamin. I barely had time to shout before Benjamin lunged at Xander, shoving him against the wall. The impact shook the entire room, the force cracking the stone behind him. Xander reacted fast, twisting out of Benjamin's grip and striking him across the jaw. Benjamin staggered back, blood dripping from his split lip, but he didn't retreat.
You don't deserve her.
Benjamin spat.
She belongs with us, not with your kind.
Xander wiped his mouth, then laughed.
Us? You mean with a bunch of cowards hiding behind a madman?
Benjamin lunged again, this time pushing more. I tried to move, to do something, but the cuffs held me in place. My breath caught as Xander dodged, his movements almost too fast to follow. He twisted Benjamin's arm, forcing him to drop the blade before delivering a brutal kick to his ribs. Benjamin crashed to the floor, coughing, groaning, but Xander didn't finish him. Instead, he turned to me, his chest rising and falling rapidly.
Can you walk?
He asked, stepping toward me. I barely had time to nod before he reached for my cuffs, breaking them apart with a single tug. The metal fell to the floor with a clank, and suddenly, I was free.
Come on.
He said, grabbing my hand.
We don't have much time.
He pulled me forward, guiding me out of the lab. The hallways were in ruins, walls scorched, bodies of unconscious guards littering the ground. The scent of burning wood filled the air, and somewhere in the distance, alarms wailed. We ran, through the corridors, down secret tunnels, through the underground escape routes that I never knew existed. The moment we stepped into the open forest, a cool breeze washed over me, and I inhaled sharply, like I was breathing for the first time. I was free. Back at Xander's fortress, I sat by the fire, the warmth soaking into my skin. My hands trembled, my body weak, but my mind wouldn't stop spinning. Xander stood across the room, silent, watching me like he was afraid I'd disappear. I took a deep breath. I was wrong about everything. Xander exhaled sharply, his gaze softening.
No, I should have explained things better. I should have made you understand.
I looked at him then, really looked at him. He wasn't just some ruthless alpha. He wasn't the monster I had been raised to believe he was. He had saved me. Why? My voice was barely a whisper. Why do you even care about me? He ran a hand through his hair, his jaw tightening.
Because, Serafina, I've loved you for years.
The room felt smaller all of a sudden. What? For years? His golden eyes met mine, steady and unwavering.
I saw you many times. In the forest, by the rivers, wandering through the trees. I always stayed hidden because I knew you hated werewolves. But I still watched over you.
I didn't know what to say. My heart was caught somewhere between disbelief and something deeper, something I wasn't ready to name. Before I could speak, the door slammed open.
Alpha!
A warrior burst in, breathless, frantic.
Her father, he's here. He brought small army.
And just like that, the moment was gone. Xander's eyes darkened.
Get everyone ready, now.
I stood up, my legs still weak. I had no idea what was about to happen, but I knew one thing: this was the final battle, and I was ready. The distant sound of war drums sent a shiver through the air. I stood on the walls of Xander's fortress, looking down at the army gathered below. My father had come, not with diplomacy, not with words, but with fire and blood. His soldiers, men trained to destroy, men who had hunted werewolves like sport, stood in perfect lines, weapons gleaming under the moonlight. At the center of it all was him, my father, dressed in his pristine uniform, his silver hair combed back as if he were walking into a ballroom instead of a battlefield. He lifted his head, and even from this distance, I could see the smirk on his face.
Serafina.
His voice rang out, smooth and commanding.
Come home, my daughter.
My stomach twisted, not in fear, not in hesitation, but in pure, unfiltered rage. How dare he, after everything he had done, after all the lives he had stolen, all the lies he had fed me, after the years he had spent turning me into a weapon against my own kind. He still thought he owned me. Not anymore. I took a step forward, my fists clenched. This is my home now, and you are not my father, at least from my perspective, not anymore. His smirk disappeared.
Then you will die with the rest of them.
And with that, he raised his hand. And the war began. The first explosion sent shrapnel flying through the air. Soldiers charged, metal clashing against claws as Xander's wolves leaped into battle. The ground trembled under the weight of the fight, the roars of shifting wolves blending with the screams of men. I didn't hesitate. I ran straight into the chaos. A soldier lunged at me, his blade aiming for my ribs. I dodged, twisted, and slammed my elbow into his jaw. He stumbled back, and I took the opening, grabbing his own dagger and driving it into his shoulder. I wasn't just fighting for survival, I was fighting for freedom. From him. From the past. from the lies. I turned just in time to see my father cutting his way through the battlefield, moving toward me with terrifying precision.
Serafina,
He called, his voice slicing through the noise. I spun, my chest heaving.
you don't have to do this.
He continued, stepping closer.
These creatures have poisoned your mind.
Poisoned my mind? That was rich. I let out a harsh laugh, shaking my head. The only one who ever poisoned me was you. His expression darkened.
I raised you.
You experimented on me. He didn't even flinch.
I made you stronger.
Something inside me snapped. Number you made me a prisoner. For a moment there was silence. Then, slowly, he sighed.
A shame.
And then he drew his sword. I barely had time to react before my father lunged. The blade whistled through the air, a streak of silver in the moonlight. I stepped back, barely avoiding the strike, my heartbeat hammering. He was fast, faster than I had ever seen him move, but before he could strike again, Xander was there. He came between us in a blur of movement, his own blade meeting my father's with a metallic clash. The force of the impact sent sparks flying. My father's eyes narrowed.
You think you can stop me, Wolf?
Xander didn't speak. He just attacked. The fight was brutal, fast, precise, lethal. My father fought with the cold precision of a man who had been training for war his entire life. But Xander fought with fury. And fury was stronger. They moved like shadows, dodging, striking, countering. My father was losing ground, his breath turning ragged, his movements desperate. And then, Xander saw his opening. A single, final strike. My father's eyes widened in shock as Xander's blade drove through his chest. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in his face. His lips parted, maybe to say something, maybe to curse me one last time, but no sound came. His body staggered, and then he fell. The war was over. The silence after a battle is always the loudest. The fortress was in ruins. The fires still burned, the smoke curling into the night sky. But the war had ended. The remaining soldiers, my father's men, had surrendered. I stood there, breathing hard, my body aching, my mind spinning. It was over, but the weight of it all, the pain, the loss, the relief, was too much. I turned, searching, and found Xander standing a few feet away. His golden eyes locked onto mine, unreadable, his chest rising and falling with exhaustion. He had just saved me. Again, he had fought for me, he had destroyed for me, and all I could do was stare. My throat was tight. My legs felt unsteady. My hands trembled at my sides. I didn't even think. I just moved. Before I could stop myself, I stepped forward and grabbed Xander's face in both hands and kissed him. His body stiffened in shock, but only for a second, and then he kissed me back. His hands gripped my waist, pulling me against him, deepening the kiss, claiming me in a way that made my heart race. There was no hesitation, no doubt, only raw, unspoken emotion crashing between us like a storm. When we finally broke apart, he rested his forehead against mine, his breath uneven. I swallowed hard, my voice barely a whisper. I hated you for so long. He smirked slightly.
I know.
I exhaled shakily, but I was wrong. Xander brushed a strand of hair from my face, his touch gentle.
You were worth waiting for, Serafina.
A lump formed in my throat. I didn't have the words to answer him, so instead, I kissed him again. And this time I didn't stop. This was our new beginning,